And now, today's featured speakers are Senior Lecturer Kiana Pierre-Louis, class of 1999, and Assistant Professor Chris Skipwith. Kiana is a Senior Lecturer in the Law, Taxation, and Financial Planning Department. She began teaching at Bentley in 2008 as an adjunct professor and became a lecturer in 2015. In addition to being a professor at Bentley, Kiana is also an alumna, having graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Business Communications and a minor in English. She received a Juris Doctorate from Suffolk University Law School in 2002 and passed the bar that same year. Kiana is also a co-leader of the Sharon Racial Equity Alliance in the town of Sharon, Massachusetts, and sits on the board of directors for Code Connect Incorporated, a nonprofit organization helping marginalized youth to get access to STEM classes for little to no cost. Chris has been an assistant professor of biotechnology in the Department of Natural and Applied Sciences since 2015. Chris is also an adjunct faculty member in biotechnology programs at Northeastern University. Chris earned a Bachelor of Science in Materials Science and Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a PhD in Biochemistry and Molecular Biophysics from the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. Chris's research seeks to link the development of novel devices for point-of-care diagnostics with studies of policy, patenting, business, and public health implications. In addition to his teaching and research endeavors, Chris is a scientific review officer and consultant for a Boston area venture capital firm, in addition to being on the scientific advisory boards of 2 clinical diagnostics companies. Chris is a co-investigator for the NIH-funded annual Biomedical Research Conference for Minority Students, ABR-CMS, coordinating education and training resources for research trainees. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming our faculty members, Kiana Pierre-Louis and Chris Skipwith. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everybody. I will start it off, and I am going to go over the legal perspective on why there is racial disparity in COVID-19 cases. And just a caveat, anything that I'm going to talk about, I could literally do an hour for each, but I want to condense it, one, to give my colleague, Chris Skipwith, time, and also give you guys time for some question and answers at the end of it. So at a convention of the Medical Committee of Human Rights in Chicago in March 1966, Martin Luther King declared, of all the forms of injustice, all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and humane. Fast forward 50 years later, and there are still many health injustices that still exist in America today. People of color, particularly Blacks, are experiencing more serious illness and death due to COVID-19 than whites. Longstanding systemic health and social inequalities have put some members of racial and ethnic minority groups at an increased risk of getting COVID-19, regardless of age, and dying of COVID-19. Racism suffuses nearly every system and institution in the United States. And the COVID-19 crisis just really has highlighted and magnified that racial inequality existed way before the pandemic. It actually is a pandemic of itself. So what I'm going to do is give a brief overview on how the laws and policies in the US have perpetuated this systemic and institutional racism and discrimination that have led to this disparity in COVID cases and in deaths. By the way, you will notice that I use my hands. That's just me. I use my hands. I hope it's not a distraction. Before I get into kind of the breakdown on the systemic racism and the laws and policies, I just want to give you a glimpse of some data, and Chris will go into it a little bit deeper, but some glimpse of some data that has come out recently. So as of May 2020, data from 48 states plus Washington, D.C. reported that race and ethnicity is known for around half of all cases and 90% of deaths. Now understand that this data there are still gaps in it, and there actually needs to be a lot more data when we're breaking down race and ethnicity. However, it is clear that communities of color are being hit disproportionately hard by COVID-19 cases, just in the little bit of data we have. Nationally, African American deaths from COVID-19 are nearly 2 times greater than would be expected based on their share population. And if you don't know their population in the United States, it is about 12.7%. Now, just some data from some states at the bottom. More than 70% of deaths in Louisiana are African American, even though they make up about 32% of the population. Nearly 70% of COVID deaths in Chicago are Black, even though they only make up 30.1%. Also, this is 6 times more fatal than whites. Additionally, they account for more than half of the cases that have tested positive in Chicago. Blacks have. 70% of deaths in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, are Blacks, even though they make up approximately 24.6% of the population. And then lastly, a recent published paper that came out regarding epidemiology shows that although Black counties account for 30% of the US population, they are the location of 56% of COVID-19 deaths. Now, please note that there is a huge disparity also in Latinx, Hispanics, and Native Americans when it comes. Again, I can go so deep about all these races. However, just for time's sakes, I really will carve it down to Blacks. But just note that a report came out last week regarding Hispanic children and that they're overwhelmingly seeing high cases in Hispanic children as well. So just for note after this, if you want to take a look at that. So I have broken down to 3 reasons why there's this disparity, and that is living conditions, working conditions, and health circumstances, and I will break those down. There are several reasons within these why there's disparity, and they're really all interconnected. I am going to discuss how the laws and policies have played a major role in systemic and institutional discrimination and racism, and how they actually have built off each other to really cause a devastating effect on people of color. So living conditions. I'm sure some of you have seen this lovely map before, which is a redlining map that we have had. So I'm going to talk about redlining, racial segregation, and environmental racism, which may be new for some. So let's start with racial segregation and redlining. Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that was announced in 1896 that announced this notion of separate but equal, which meant that the races, mainly Blacks and whites, could live separately, go to school separately, have accommodations, train, so on, separate but equal. So it was okay, it was constitutional as long as it was separate but equal. We know time and time again, seeing case after case, it was never equal, but this lasted up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Most people believe that the notion of separate but equal was abolished when Brown versus Board of Education came out in 1954. That is actually incorrect. Brown versus Board really dealt with racial segregation in public schools, and they made that unconstitutional. But however, still in public accommodations, it was still legal up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the reason why I bring that up is I want you to understand that racial segregation was really almost in existence for 70 years. That plays a part into redlining and this creation of the suburbs. So after World War II ended, soldiers came home and received benefits from the GI Bill. This was especially important because this was the beginning of the 1940s, which was really the beginning of the suburbs as we know it today. And so veterans basically, when they came back, in order to be able to get some wealth and get housing, they received benefits through housing through these GI Bills. However, for African American veterans, this benefit wasn't really bestowed on them. Now, while the GI Bill alone did not have language excluding African American veterans from its benefit, the way it was structured, which I'll get into briefly, ultimately shut the door to 1.2 million Black veterans that fought for this country. So how does this look? In 1930s, because of the Depression and everything, a lot of laws were implemented. And I will just note, even though I won't go into it, in 1935, Social Security was created, and that was really a safety net for millions of workers, guaranteeing them income after they retired. However, in that bill, when it was created in that act, the domestic servants and agricultural workers were excluded from Social Security. When you look at who were agricultural workers and domestic servants, they were largely African American, Mexican, and Asians. So they were actually excluded from Social Security benefits. So also in 1934, President Roosevelt founded the Fair Housing Administration. That was a government program that had projects within private sectors. This was really uncommon during that time because federal governments usually allowed state government to handle most matters. So basically what was happening was the federal government was subsidizing low cost housing. Also in the 30s, the National Appraisal System was put into place to give guidance to banks in the loan approval process. So the FHA and the NAS, along with using some census information, would go around the country and basically create color-coded maps to give guidance to bank on risk on who to loan. So maps largely looked like this. And the different tiers obviously indicated risk. So again, red was high risk, green, obviously low risk, and all in between. Overwhelmingly, it has been shown that one of the number one factors into giving a red designation was race. Not the only, obviously criminal and some poverty was into that, but one of the number one factors was race. So what does that look like? Of the $120 billion worth of new housing subsidies the government gave between 1934 and 1962, less than 2% went to non-white families. So said in another way, 98% of those subsidies went to whites. So basically, non-whites were effectively locked out of home ownership, lower, cheaper home ownership during that time. Other things that were happening were things called restrictive covenants, and that largely, quickly, that was just covenants that go with deed and title, that basically within it, and it just would pass through title, that said Blacks could not basically buy this property, could not be in this area. This was challenged in 1948 in a case called Shelley versus Kramer, and they challenged it saying restrictive covenants based on race were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court basically came down in 1948 in Shelley versus Kramer and said that racially restrictive covenants were not unconstitutional and were not per se a violation of the 14th Amendment. So fast forward all the way to 1968 when finally the Supreme Court in a case called Jones versus Alford finally said that both private and state-backed discrimination is a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and a violation of the 13th Amendment. But that wasn't until 1968. Also in 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson also came out with the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and then it was amended to deal with disability and family status. Now, again, this is all the way to 1968, but do we think that the practices stopped? No, they did not stop. Appraisers still used race when they were appraising houses as a factor. There were things called predatory lending that still happens today, racial steering that happened. And really not until 1988, where the fair housing laws kind of got a grip on these practices. So fast forward, we're already in 1988. So that means in 1970s, 1980s, and the 1990s, where housing prices really dramatically increased, that benefit was not bestowed on people of color, primarily Blacks, because they were never really even able to get into the game. And if they got into the game around 1980 and 1990, the housing was a lot more expensive. So they weren't gaining that equity. And one ways to gain equity and money in the United States is through housing. Another part is environmental racism. And I'll allow you to just look on, I always tell my students, I'm not gonna read the PowerPoint for you. So I'll allow you guys to read the PowerPoint on the definition of environmental racism. And then on the other side is some stats on what I'm gonna talk about. But in 1983, the US General Accounting Office conducted a study and found that Black people made up the majority of communities near landfills. In 1987, a newly formed Commission on Racial Justice founded that race was the strongest variable in predicting the location of waste facilities. In 2016, a study published in Environmental Research Letters basically found a consistent pattern over a 30-year period of placing hazardous waste facilities in neighborhoods where poor people and people of color lived. So to link that back to segregation and these discriminatory policies and laws that were put into place, neighborhoods with large non-white populations have historically seen lower property values, meaning that land in that area is sometimes cheaper and industrial actors will end up acquiring that land. So why does that matter with COVID? Those specific ways that COVID-19 attacks the human body are still being discovered, and Chris can go into more detail with that. Early consensus is that respiratory and heart ailments are significant risk factors with the virus. These are also conditions that are often health effects regarding environmental racism. The CDC specifically names asthma, lung disease, and diabetes as sanctions that put people at risk. And those are the same sanctions that come from this environmental racism, from these landfills being put in in communities of people of color. People of color in the US are exposed to 38% of nitrogen dioxide on average than white people. Nitrogen dioxide is linked to asthma, bronchitis, and a host of other respiratory problems. There are other environmental issues that I don't have time to go over today, but I do want to just highlight a few. Also, in communities of color, not being able to find affordable and fresh food in communities of color has been a problem. Living further away of grocery stores. So remember, during the pandemic, everybody rushed and went and hoarded a lot of things. That's harder. One, when the grocery store is farther away, and two, when you may have to use public transportation. And also the third thing to link that is relying on public transportation, which again is a closed, encompassed space. Working conditions. So a lot of what I said regarding redlining and the housing market will pull us forward to the racial wealth gap. So the racial wealth gap is basically a net worth a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of Black family. If that shocks you, what really should shock you is this has been increasing since the 80s, not decreasing. So to put that with numbers, we're talking about the median income. A typical white family median worth is $171,000, which is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family, which is $17,150. This is also the same disparity in even the top 10% of income earners, which, by the way, Blacks only make up out of that top 10%, 3.6%. The racial wealth gap is still quite large there. So a median net worth of a white family in that percent is $1,789,300 versus $343,160 for Black families. So really in all of these areas, a racial gap really exists, except the very bottom tier, which, by the way, Blacks make up 23.5% of that tier. And the reason why there is no gap is because the median net worth is zero for everybody. So there have been efforts by Black Americans to build wealth in this country to kind of, even though the gaps have happened and the laws have really perpetuated this discrimination, there have been ways, but even at every turn, there has been disasters that really been perpetuated by the government. First, there was a mismanagement of Freedman Savings Bank, which really was full name is the Freedman, if anybody want to look it up, the Freedman Saving and Trust Company. There was a mismanage of that was to help newly freed slaves. The violent massacre disseminating Tulsa and Greenwood, which is also known as Black Wall Street, Jim Crow, Black codes, the GI Bill. There's a whole host of issues that have blocked to kind of, make this gap a little shorter. Third, but definitely not least, is health circumstances. So health disparities, again, I put up the definition on the side that has white. I am really going to focus on the blue side and kind of go through how the health disparities really look. So when the Affordable Care Act was enacted, there were some coverage gains under the Affordable Care Act. And it did basically reduce percentage point differences in uninsured rates between the population of color and whites. However, still in 2018, Blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives, and Native Hawaiians and other specifically islanders remain more likely to be uninsured compared to whites. So when you see AIAN and NHOPI, that is acronyms for American Indians and Alaskan Natives and Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. I know it's long. One of the main reasons why was cost of healthcare. That was one of the main reasons why people are underinsured or uninsured. Also, lower access of healthcare. Medical facilities in Black and Brown communities usually offer poorer quality care. There are no resources to deal with very sick individuals. There are rarely any specialists, no PPEs, and no ventilators really to deal with. A third reason is the distrust of healthcare. I'm sure most of you have heard of Tuskegee, Guatemala, maybe not. But Tuskegee, and I cannot go through all of it right now, but I'll give you a highlight. Tuskegee is largely passed down in the Black community on why you should not trust when any researcher wants to do testing on the Black community. It was an experiment that started in 1932 to treat so-called syphilis. They procured 600 men to be a part of this. 399 of those men had latent syphilis symptoms, and 201 did not have syphilis at all, and they were being told that they were going to be treated for bad blood. Usually, out of these 600, they were primarily sharecroppers who had never seen doctors before. And this research was done by the United States Public Health Service. So the men were monitored by health workers, but they were really only given placebos like aspirin. So they were really never being treated for syphilis for the ones who had it. And even in 1947, because the research lasted years, in 1947, when penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis, they still were never given given penicillin, to treat syphilis. The PHS, so the Public Health Service researchers convinced the local physicians in the Macon County not to basically treat physicians because they really wanted to see how bad, they wanted to track the disease and see how bad it could get. In the mid-1960s, not until one investigator, PHS investigator, said, this is not right, this is unethical, blew the whistle to a committee, the PHS committee, and said what they're doing is unethical. They ignored it and still continued the treatments. Finally, that person, that investigator, had enough, and in 1972 went to the media. So this happened from 1932 to 1972. They went to the media and blew the whistle. There was a settlement. President Bill Clinton in 1997 issued an apology for these tests. However, not the last apology for certain US-sponsored tests. In 2010, President Barack Obama basically also had to apologize for another US-sponsored unethical study that happened in Guatemala. This was between the dates of 1946 and 1948, with nearly 700 men and women, prisoners, soldiers, and mental patients were intentionally affected with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases without their consent and knowledge. And the purpose of this study was to determine whether penicillin could prevent, not just treat, the disease. So the distrust is embedded. And Chris will go in a little deeper about that. Also, higher rates of chronic conditions that we talked about, really regarding environmental racism. And then last but not least, and I will pass it over, is racism, stigma, and systemic inequalities. So doctors consistently refer Black patients to lower quality hospitals, or they don't believe their symptoms. Infant mortality among Blacks is 1.5 to 3 times higher than whites. And advanced breast cancer diagnosis, so basically Black women have a higher rate of advanced breast cancer diagnosis than white women. Even though white women get breast cancer more often, Black women are more often likely to die from breast cancer. So all of these is a really brief explanation of the kind of systemic and institutionalized racism and discrimination that really has caused this, or COVID-19 has really highlighted, and is really seeing a significant of deaths within the Black community. Now I will pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Chris G. Skipwith, Assistant Professor of Biotechnology in the Department of Applied Natural and Applied Sciences at Bentley University. He will be discussing the structural failures of the coordinated U.S. response in clinical diagnostics, treatment, and prevention. In doing this, he will use the WHO working group principles for measuring national performance in COVID-19 responses.
Thank you very much, Kiana, for that introduction. And thank you for your general introduction to what we're dealing with this pandemic in America. And so I'm going to talk about a little more about what's going on in terms of the science of what we know, and then some general guidelines to think about, especially when thinking about racial and ethnic disparities in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the title of my portion is Taking a Pandemic View of America, Warnings for Science, Medicine, and Public Health. And I always like to speak to the students by getting a bad joke out of the way. That way, you know, I'm golden going through. And so I do have a bad joke right behind me here. I'm going to move to the side. It says, I told a chemistry joke and there was no reaction. So worst joke of the day out of the way, and we're ready to go forward. So I like to notify you of my interests and a disclaimer. So first, the disclaimer, I am not a medical doctor. I have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biophysics. My expertise is on the molecular mechanisms of SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, but also looking at diagnostics, treatment, and vaccine development. However, I cannot give you advice on medical issues related to COVID-19. And then also in terms of my interest, I am on the board of a company that is developing rapid COVID-19 testing. I'm also a consultant on an NIH SBIR, which is a small business grant that's going in August, that is specifically dealing with a company that is developing a point of care diagnostic test for COVID-19. And then I also am an adjunct faculty member at Northeastern and teaching students who are actually doing work in their high capacity COVID-19 testing facility. So 7 months into the pandemic, US government officials and scientists still disagree over basic safety guidance on the coronavirus, and people are still disregarding key public health advice. And I'm sure you've seen this a lot on social media circles, but we're still seeing leading public health information organizations revise their understanding of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, which causes COVID-19. But my warning to you is that the fact that messaging from public health and scientific experts has changed during the pandemic is actually a sign of progress. And it's not completely unexpected. And I hope the information I present to you will show that. Before the pandemic, scientists knew of several other types of coronaviruses that could infect humans. But until SARS-CoV-2 began to make people sick, scientists had never needed to study how this particular virus attacks the human body. Now, as researchers study SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 at breakneck speeds, one key aspect to keep in mind is that the research is happening while everyone watches. The public is literally getting front row seats to the scientific method, probably in a way that they never imagined they would have experienced, or at least in a way that so many individuals are interested because it affects their day-to-day lives so acutely. And I would argue that never in human history have we seen public health, political, and commercial interest align with the development of basic science. For the most part, the public is given the benefit of 10 to 15 years of basic science to inform decisions that are made. But right now, it's actually happening at the same time. The short story is that science is a messy process. And generally speaking, the scientific method is how scientists investigate unexplained phenomena and mysteries about this world and other worlds. It entails getting acquainted with substantial amounts of information just to be able to formulate a hypothesis and then explore the mystery. With that body of knowledge under their belts, scientists can then move on to investigating those research questions with clever experiments, and then to publishing articles that report their scientific findings in an academic journal. But before a journal publishes those findings, virtually all aspects of a study or paper are evaluated by scientists who are top experts in their own fields. Partly because of that scrupulous review, journals rarely accept papers on first submission, and they often reject them altogether. This system, which is known as peer review, isn't flawless, but it has been the hallmark of research for decades. And if a faulty study does make it through scientific publication and other scientists find holes in it, the study could be retracted or at least highly debated and reanalyzed. Depending on the type of journal and how many revisions the initial manuscript needs, publishing scientific findings can take several months. But now that the entire world is rushing to find treatments and vaccines for coronavirus, scientists are trying to share their findings as quickly as possible. And to speed the process of sharing new science, many researchers have turned to something called a preprint server, which has scientific reports that are released publicly online before going through the aforementioned peer review process. And during the pandemic, scientists have swamped preprint servers with new research. The science in those preprints can help researchers from different labs communicate among each other and generate important collaborations, but they can also be a double-edged sword. Papers based on unvetted science can reach the public eye, becoming dangerous fake news and influencing public policy with flawed research. And just to give you a sense of the volume of research that's out there, I'm going to show you something that's called an aggregator system, which actually goes out into the internet and brings in a lot of different research articles that are tied to certain keywords. So the aggregator system that I'm going to show you is called Meta, and this is free. You can actually get Meta yourself. You just have to sign up for an account, and it is at meta.org. And so I've done a search that's based on the keywords COVID-19, 2019-nCoV, which was actually the initial name of the virus when it was first discovered, COVID-19, COVID-19 altogether, and then SARS-CoV-2. So hopefully what I'm doing is I'm capturing a number of articles that are talking about the virus that causes COVID-19 and the disorder itself. And so what we see is that there have been almost 500 papers today that have been released. And then if I go on to yesterday, let's say, there were about 219 papers. And so what I'm actually going to do is just filter the paper types. And I will filter them using only preprints. So these are the ones that are unvetted, that are posted basically right at the time that they are formulated. And so what we see is that today there are 6 papers in preprint servers. If we go back to yesterday, there are 5 papers in preprint servers. And then if we go back a little more, then we can see that there are 37 papers on Sunday. If we look beyond that, we can see that on Saturday, there were a few less. Let's see, there weren't any on Saturday, it looks like. And then on Friday, there were 2 papers, and then 17 on last Thursday. And so if you were to add up all the papers that are coming out regarding SARS-CoV-2 over the last week or so, you get well over 100. And actually in the middle of the pandemic, especially early this summer, we were getting 20 to 50 papers every single day coming out on these preprint servers. This just gives you a sense of what's going on with a lot of the things that we're evaluating with science. And one area where the rapidly developing science has become problematic is the collection, vetting, and reporting of data concerning racial disparities in COVID-19. Indeed, many states and municipalities who failed to include this level of demographic detail in early testing began releasing data sets incorporating this. To gain a maximally precise picture of how vulnerability is distributed, it's crucial to collect more data along these lines. The experience of past epidemics and recent natural disasters suggests that the most socially marginalized populations will suffer disproportionately. It is equally important, however, that in documenting COVID-19 racial disparities, we contextualize this data with adequate analysis. Disparity figures without explanatory context can perpetuate harmful myths and misunderstandings that actually undermine the goal of eliminating health inequities. And today, I'll present some of the dangers that researchers, clinicians, public health officials, and health communication experts must acknowledge when evaluating the impact of COVID-19. First, we must ensure that access to and reliability of testing is ensured for all populations. Second, we must be careful with biological explanations of health disparities. And then third, we must consider disparities in drug and vaccine development. So first, on ensuring reliability of testing for all populations. The interpretation and policy decisions made based on testing should be carefully assessed for bias. Tragically, the United States was unable to match other countries' response, and it's tallied the most cases and deaths in the world. And recent data suggests that those tallies are actually underestimates. And then the question becomes, why has the US response been so ineffectual? One key answer is in testing, which has been a cornerstone of COVID-19 control elsewhere. US testing to identify people infected with SARS-CoV-2 was slow to start, and to this day has not sufficiently ramped up. Testing was delayed in January and February as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, distributed faulty test kits, then failed to approve a working test developed by the World Health Organization or those developed by local public health laboratories. For more context, the CDC created a test requiring a slow reaction on a specific model of machine to be run overnight. They also didn't design the right reagents or materials to run with that test, and then they didn't realize it for over a month. This was strategically by using a 30-year-old technology, and tactically by designing the wrong primers or reagents used, incompetent. And then the CDC was also initially inflexible on testing guidelines, such as needing travel or exposure history, and not widely distributing testing. Since March, the numbers of tests per day was slow to reach the numbers needed because of shortages of reagents, materials, and personal protective equipment. To date, efforts to bolster testing have focused on operational issues, such as whether testing capacity is inadequate or adequate, why shortages and supply chain failures are so pervasive, and how to scale up testing to the massive numbers needed to mitigate the US epidemic. Yet offering more tests is not a strategy in and of itself. If enough tests were available, we would still need to answer a fundamental question. What are the test results meant to inform? To understand which neighborhoods and communities face raging outbreaks and why, researchers need demographic information, both on who gets tested and who tests positive, including their race and ethnicity. But even as US testing infrastructure improves, testing remains sparse in many low-income and minority neighborhoods. Federal guidance released last month will require laboratories to report on race and ethnicity, and that actually started on August 1st. Data from New York City suggests that early in the pandemic, testing failed to reach those who need it the most. And among the city's 177 zip codes, the number of tests performed between the 2nd of March and the 6th of April rose with the percentage of white residents in a zip code, while the proportion of positive tests decreased with white population. In an unpublished follow-up analysis, this group has seen that progress as the city set up more test sites in underserved areas actually increased. And by mid-May, testing rates didn't correlate with the racial makeup of a zip code. But when the team looked to expand its analysis beyond New York City, they learned that many states don't publish how many people they test, just how many they test positive. And then that makes it harder to know whether some groups are undercounted. Now, this leads to my second point. Evaluation of testing data in a vacuum can give rise to biologic explanations for racial health disparities. Such explanations posit that congenital qualities or qualities at birth that are unique to very specific racial minorities predispose them to higher rates of a particular disease. Take, for instance, what happened in June of 2020. The consumer genetics giant 23andMe CEO called her product both Eurocentric and said that her company is part of the problem. And competitors Ancestry and Nebula Genomics put out their own statements acknowledging similar issues with their products. And while the field at large for genetics have been too white mixed leadership in its data and products, Black individuals and other people of color are underrepresented in genetic studies databases and reference genomes, and I'll describe why this is the case in a second. While there's been some progress, these problems have resulted in tests that primarily only work for people of European ancestry, and the basis of this lies in something called a polygenic risk score. And this encapsulates the diversity problems in genetics. These are tests that gather multiple genetic variants together and use them to predict someone's chances of developing a disease. So far, many of the commercial polygenic risk score tests have come with warnings that they're not very accurate or are even useless in people who are not of European ancestry because the references come from mostly those who are of European ancestry. But the truly problematic consequence of this type of thinking can lead to devastating consequences in times of a public health emergency, when in the absence of national guidelines, clinicians must decide how to allocate scarce resources, including personal protective equipment, ICU access, and ventilators. Normally, there is something called a state-based crisis of standards documents that aim to provide objective guidance for allocating scarce resources in a crisis. Underlying CSCs is the principle of doing the greatest good for the most people by saving the most life years. And this principle is fundamentally identity blind, but in reality, it will almost certainly ensure the opposite, with devastating effects on disadvantaged communities. Some 70 to 80% of the difference in life expectancy between Black Americans and white Americans can actually be explained by socioeconomic factors. Unfortunately, healthcare actually has a poor track record in incorporating race and other social factors into resource allocations. For example, race has been used to correct for differences in the estimated glomerular filtration rate, or eGFR, which is a surrogate for kidney function. Ideally, any correction should mitigate observed inequities in time to dialysis and kidney transplantation for Black patients. Unfortunately, this correction was developed on the basis of biologic differences without accounting for equity concerns, and it actually may contribute to worsening Black patients' access to dialysis and transplantation. The third danger has a lot less to do with what has been done, but what's on the horizon. And as the scientific literature booms on a daily basis regarding drugs and vaccines in development, it's important to continue to keep marginalized populations at the forefront. I'm going to focus our discussion on vaccines, but there's a lot to talk about in testing and treatment. The early data on vaccines suggests that they appear to be reactogenic, meaning that they have induced short-term discomfort in a percentage of people who have received them in clinical trials. Now, as long as the side effects of eventual COVID-19 vaccines are transient and not severe, they really shouldn't be sources of alarm. In fact, they might be signals of an immune system lurching into gear. It's a simple fact that some vaccines are more unpleasant to take than others. Think about the pain of a tetanus shot for those of you all who have had it. But it will ultimately make sense to prepare people now for the possibility that COVID-19s may be reactogenic. And getting people prepared for this fact lets them know what to expect when the vaccine becomes available. Although there's plenty of evidence out there that people will accept reactogenic vaccines, if they are concerned enough about the condition the vaccine is designed to prevent. But the behavior of many Americans suggests that they don't see COVID-19 as a particular threat, with many resisting wearing masks and following social distancing recommendations that have successfully driven down transmission in a number of other parts of the world. And a variety of polls suggest that between half and 70% of Americans plan to be vaccinated when COVID-19 vaccine becomes available. Figures that raise concerns about, in some quarters, about the ability of vaccines to trigger herd immunity in the US population. And just to let you know, estimates have been around 80% that will actually be needed to trigger herd immunity based on the R0, or basic reproduction number. But the danger in this assumption is that everyone in the public responds to scientific information in the same way. And I'm sure you're familiar, as Kiana presented, with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, an inhuman project that has stained biomedical research ever since. One of the most well-known vaccines in development is by Oxford AstraZeneca, and it's caused quite some controversy lately. What seems to have happened is that many took the headline to mean that this was the first vaccine trial anywhere and that an African population was being used in the initial test subjects, but that's not the case. The Oxford vaccine started in England. The next phase of the study recruited over 10,000 volunteers around the country, and they're testing in South Africa simply because it's in the Southern Hemisphere where winter is coming on, and then they're gonna have to go to locations where the epidemic is spreading. That's why they've also announced a 2,000 patient trial in Brazil. If you want good statistics on how your vaccine protects people from infection, your best shot is to go to a population where the likelihood of this infection is higher. You'll find similar things with other vaccines. Not one of them has been tested in Africa so far. There is no pattern of Africa being used as essentially a test bed for these new therapies, but this has invaded public discourse. And there is no pattern of African-American patients here in the US being used as such either. In fact, the worries about low enrollment in that community, you'll see that it's a big thing about mistrust about medical research that's stemming from things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. That's the frustrating part. As we go on, we're going to need data on those vaccine candidates from a wide range of people as we can possibly get. The response of human beings to disease and disease treatment varies across a huge, complicated landscape of genetic, social, and environmental factors, many of them interacting with each other. And the only way to evaluate something like this is to test it as broadly as possible. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is there's about 40% of the population, and some estimates are as low as 20%, of Black people who said that they would not get a vaccine. Now, we often do say in the community that this number is slightly underrepresented. In fact, these are people who are willing to respond. There have been some other surveys that have been done that have actually estimated this number to be up to 60% of those in the Black community who said they would not get a vaccine. Regardless what the actual number is, it's overrepresented in the Black community versus other races and ethnicities. So in sum, it's the responsibility of researchers, clinicians, public health officials, and health communication experts to take necessary measures to mitigate myths of racial biology, behavioral explanations predicated on racial stereotypes, and stigmatization in evaluating the impact of COVID-19 in the development of therapies and vaccines. COVID-19 disparities should be situated in the context of material resource deprivation caused by low socioeconomic status, chronic stress brought on by racial discrimination, or place-based risk. And there are some resources here, and I'd be glad to distribute this if you'd like, so you can check out those resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. So much good information. I just want to share with everyone who's watching that we will have a recording of this session. So if you want to go back and Google something or take a look at the stats and figures that both of our presenters have offered, we will have the recording available. But now let's dig into some question and answer. And the first question will be one of our pre-submitted questions that you each can respond to. Kiana, maybe you go first to give Chris a break again. What are some of the changes that would be more permanent versus temporary because of the COVID pandemic?
Great question. So again, I'm going to stay out the medical because that is not my area. But some of the reasons that I kind of laid out, wealth disparity, living conditions, environmental racism, they all have to be looked at. If anybody who did this work prior, me being one of them, knew when this pandemic hit, there was soon going to be a report that there was going to be a disparity and Blacks were going to get hit the hardest. So it was not a shock when it came to me, because if you actually looked at how the foundation of this country was built and some of the laws and policies, you knew. So in order for the wealth gap to get narrowed, in order for environmental racism, one, education. As I always tell my students, you don't know what you don't know. So you have to really dig in and do your due diligence to figure out why there is such a systemic and institutional racism here. And I hope that we've helped you. Then go in and figure out, and it's really regarding voting, changing the policies, changing tax laws, changing healthcare disparities, getting these waste and landfills out of predominantly communities of color. Because, by the way, as we know, in environment, the climate, it moves, it's global. It is not just stuck in one society. So it really impacts everybody if this is happening in the United States. But it is kind of layered, and really the work has to be done at the ground level. So first, I would say really digging deep on some of the things that I've highlighted, because it's not everything. Start there, and then really going in and figuring out the best policies to change and really dismantle. There is no going back and fixing. It needs to be torn down, dismantled, and then brought back up to be more equitable and more justice. And I'll leave it like that.
Chris, you're on mute. If you want to add what you think has changed for the permanent or for the temporary.
Right, so I'm not necessarily going to speak on any of the political or sort of commercial ramifications, but within the basic science community, what has changed is the way that we've thought about academic publishing regarding how we do convey information to the public. It's largely a very insular process where, and I'm sure if anyone has gone out and tried to read a lot of the basic research to support any of your assertions, you've seen that the text is very dense, it's very difficult to read. Sometimes it does have a lot of jargon, and there's been a movement within the community, and actually recently in the journal Nature, just yesterday, there was an article published that called for a complete upheaval of the peer review system so that we can actually develop things that are useful for the public. I'm not sure if everyone knows, but there's actually been an analysis by my colleagues at Bentley University that has shown that the public money, so money that's gone to the NIH that's been used to look at basic research in the biomedical sciences, that public money has led to 100% of the new drugs that have come out within the last 10 years. And so there's tremendous public investment in the biomedical research enterprise. And so there should be a lot of efforts from biomedical scientists to try to convey that information well. And you'll see that during COVID-19, there hasn't been an effective strategy to communicate new information that's come out. And that's actually caused a lot of the reticence to follow basic public health protocols because the information changes so rapidly.
Thank you both. All right, another question for you, Chris. How accurate are the antibody tests now for COVID-19, if you're able to speak on that?
Yeah, so it's a very broad question, I'll say, and I'll preface that by saying accuracy is viewed in probably about 6 different ways within the diagnostic testing community. So there are 3 basic principles. There's something called analytic validity, which basically says, are you actually measuring what you think you're measuring? There's something called clinical validity, which is basically what you're measuring actually tied to the clinical manifestation. So in the case of the antibody tests, do the antibodies mean that you have developed immunity to COVID-19? And then there's another one that's called clinical utility, which means how can clinicians use this to actually evaluate the state of someone? And so with those 3 measures alone, there's differences in opinion about how valid they are. In terms of analytical validity, there are about 60 major serology tests out there, and I'm not sure if everyone knew that, but for antibody tests, there are about 60 of them. And there was a big meta-analysis that was done on the commercially available test that was done. Actually, it was published last week as a preprint. And what it saw was that the analytical validity is actually spread tremendously, and that there's no consensus on whether or not these things are measuring what they're meant to measure. And if you were to change the context slightly, that analytical validity would change quite a bit. In terms of the clinical validity is actually a little better. So we do know that the presence of antibodies can exhibit, let's say, short-term immunity, but then also long-term immunity. And one of the big arguments in the scientific community has been, if you don't have a high titer or high amount of antibodies, have you then diminished potentially your resistance to getting COVID-19? It turns out that that's not the case, that for the most part with adaptive immunity, you should actually be resistant to COVID-19. That's only if it doesn't mutate significantly, which is actually another discussion that we can have. But in terms of clinical utility, none of the existing antibody tests have really been shown to have tremendous clinical utility. So if that's really what you mean by reliable or how accurate they are, clinical utility is extremely low, analytical validity is kind of marginal, and clinical validity is actually pretty high.
Thank you. Well, we only have a few minutes remaining, so perhaps you could, is there any last thought or suggestion for our audience that you would give this afternoon?
Can I answer? There was a question in the chat.
Oh, yes, I missed it. Thank you, Kiana.
No worries. And it said, what do you mean by there's no fix in the system, it needs to be torn down? And I really mean fully, not the whole entire system. I didn't mean that. But I mean that the system was really built on institutional racism. It was kind of built on that. And you have to go back and look at some of those. And really, they can't be fixed. You can't keep trying to put a Band-Aid on them. They have to be, you know, taken down and then fixed to really, if you're really talking about equity and justice. I always say that, you know, when so when we're talking about people like the overwhelming amounts of asthma coming out of the community of color, we are treating the asthma, but we're not treating why they are getting asthma. So that's what I mean. You can't just keep treating the symptoms. We have to go back and treat really what's causing it. And if we keep just treating the symptoms, this is going to be an area. So for future generations, what I mean is you really got to go back to what's causing the problem and really go back and fix that, dismantle that. So there is no longer this continuing cyclical problem that's continuing to happen.
So I guess in terms of final thoughts, I'll kind of hark back to the discussion about the significant amount of research that's coming out daily. And one of the questions I believe that was pre-submitted, and I believe I answered it during the talk, but I want to make sure that I do address it now. And that's, what do you say to never maskers and people who kind of avoid social distancing guidelines? And they use kind of the evidence to show, or the lack of evidence, let's say, to show the fact that they're ineffective. One of the things to remember is that, like I said, unlike any other time in human history, the basic science is developing at the same time that people are making policy decisions, that people are making decisions about public health measures, and that people are making financial decisions. And when that happens, and the public is used to having at least 10 to 15 years of basic science governing their decisions, there is going to be discord. There's going to be change. And so I'd implore you to talk about the fact that the science is changing simply because we're discovering things at the same pace that society is moving.
Well, thank you both so much. Oh, Kiana, do you have a final thought? Feel free.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's kind of what I already said, which is really, again, it's really about, we're all students. We're all in this life to learn. And I think everybody just really needs to, you know, do their due diligence and really educate themselves on all this, especially to what Chris said. I mean, a lot of what Chris said, even me, is going like this, but I'm going to go back and do my due diligence and learn about the antibody testing. I think we have to continue to educate ourselves about these things in order to figure out what to do. So continue to learn, continue to do active listening, and not listening just to come up with an argument, but really listening and then going back to double check. You don't have to always believe what people say, but, you know, double check. But I really think that we all need to educate ourselves on what's really going on, and why it's happening and what we can do to possibly eradicate it.
Thank you guys so much.
Actually,
Definitely.
can
Go
I
ahead.
make one last comment? So,
We have time.
okay, one thing I often do in my classes is that, so what we do is what's called a newspaper assignment. And the students basically take a newspaper article, they look at the basic science that's described within that newspaper article, and they actually go back to the sources that are quoted to see if the journalists are speaking about the science in the way that it should be actually conveyed to the public. Because what often happens is a lot of the science is distilled down to basically a 7th grade reading level so that people can understand the implications. But a lot of times there are some major violators of the rules of translating basic science to the basic language of the public. I'm not going to name the journal outlets, but you may find it if you go back to them. But what I do implore you to do is, when you read a newspaper article, go to the linked study that's actually in there and try to understand it as much as possible. If you can only read the abstract of that study, look at the conclusions that are in that abstract and try to critically analyze whether or not the newspaper article is conveying the information in a way that is consistent with what the research authors have presented, because oftentimes there are disconnects.
Thank you, Chris. That's helpful for all of us who follow Facebook and see what our friends and our family members are posting. So always be critical thinkers, as our wonderful faculty members have shared with us today. Feel free to reach out to them individually, as I'm sure you will if you've already connected with them as alums. And we're so, so grateful for your time today. Thank you again for your presentation, and we hope to welcome you back on a future virtual event soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.